Welcome to this episode of Great Cities and Institutions. Today, we are going to look at the history of Nigeria, a country that contains 1 in every 4 Africans alive, that speaks over 500 languages. And that did not exist under that name until a British journalist invented it in a newspaper column in 1897. Every week on this channel, we step inside the great cities, empires, and institutions that shape the world we still live in today, tracing not just when they rose, but why, and what it actually costs to build something meant to last forever. Some of these stories are about walls and monuments still standing. Others are about entire systems of government and belief that vanished centuries ago, yet somehow still shape how we live, how we're governed, and even the words we use, without most of us ever realizing it. Today's story is different from most we tell, because it is not the story of one city. It is the story of a piece of West Africa that held some of the most sophisticated states, artistic traditions, and constitutional systems anywhere in the pre-modern world, and which was then drawn onto a map as a single unit by administrators who were solving an accounting problem. Within the borders of modern Nigeria, people were smelting iron before Rome was a republic. Craftsmen were casting bronze of extraordinary technical refinement 300 years before the Renaissance. A Yoruba empire operated a constitutional mechanism that could legally compel its emperor to take his own life. A city in the north was walled, taxed, and trading across the Sahara while London was a market town. And a caliphate in the 19th century ran one of the largest states on the African continent, with a scholarly tradition that included a woman who built a network of teachers to educate other women across an entire empire. This is the history of Nigeria. What was there before, what happened when the Atlantic arrived, how the country was assembled, and what it has become. Let's begin with the deep past, and with the discovery made by tin miners. In recent years, a genuine process of restitution has begun, with a number of institutions and governments transferring ownership and returning pieces. That process is ongoing and began arriving on this coast, and from the 16th through the 19th centuries the region became one of the principal sources of captives for the transatlantic slave trade. The stretch of coast to the west was called the Slave Coast by European traders. The Bight of Benin and the Bight of Biafra, which together cover the coastline of modern Nigeria, saw an enormous volume of that traffic. The most careful modern estimates, drawn from the surviving records of individual voyages, indicate that well over 1 million people were taken from the Bight of Biafra alone, and the total from the wider region is very much larger. This requires honesty in two directions, and I want to give it in both. The demand was European and American. The trade existed because plantation economies in the Americas wanted labor and were prepared to pay for human beings, and because European shipping, capital, insurance, and state power organized the traffic across the ocean. That is the engine, and nothing else in this account displaces it. And the supply chain inland was operated by African states, traders, and intermediaries. Coastal city-states such as Bani, Old Calabar, and Brass grew wealthy as brokers. In the interior of the southeast, the Aero network, centered on Arachukwu and carrying the authority of a widely consulted oracle, became the dominant supplier of captives to the coast. Warfare, raiding, judicial condemnation, and debt all fed the system, and some inland states expanded specifically on its profits. Both of those things are true. Historians of the trade have long since stopped treating them as competing claims, and any telling that gives you only one half is giving you a political position rather than a history. The human consequences were catastrophic and long-lasting: population loss concentrated among the young, chronic insecurity, the militarization of politics, and the reorientation of entire economies towards supplying the coast. When Britain moved to suppress the trade in the 19th century, the coastal economies shifted to palm oil, which industrializing Europe needed for soap, candles, and machine lubricant. The same rivers, the same ports, the same brokers, a different cargo. One figure from that transition deserves naming. Jaja of Apobo was born in the Igbo interior, sold into slavery as a boy, and rose through the trading houses of Bani to become a merchant of the first rank. When rivalries in Bani became untenable, he left and founded his own settlement at Apobo, took control of the palm oil routes, and dealt directly with European firms on his own terms, at one point shipping palm oil to Liverpool himself rather than selling to the middlemen. That was the problem. A man who had been sold as a child was now setting prices to European traders. In 1887, British officials invited him to negotiations, detained him, and deported him. He died in 1891 on his way back from exile. Which brings us to how Nigeria was actually made. British involvement moved from trade to administration through the second half of the 19th century. Lagos was annexed in 1861, and a chartered company, the Royal Niger Company, was granted authority to administer and exploit the Niger Basin, competing with French and German ambitions in the scramble for African territory that followed the Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885. The name arrived before the country. In 1897, a journalist at the Times of London named Flora Shaw published a piece proposing that the territories around the lower Niger be collectively called Nigeria. She later married Frederick Lugard, the colonial administrator who would govern it. By 1900, the British government had taken over from the company, and the territory was administered as two separate entities: the Protectorate of Northern Nigeria and the Protectorate of Southern Nigeria, plus the colony of Lagos. They were run differently, by different men, with different policies. And then, on the 1st of January 1914, they were amalgamated into a single colony and Protectorate of Nigeria under Lugard as Governor-General. The reason for the amalgamation is worth stating plainly, because it explains a great deal about what followed. The Northern Protectorate did not generate enough revenue to pay for its own administration and required a subsidy. The Southern Protectorate, with its ports and its export trade, ran a surplus. Merging them meant the South's revenues covered the North's deficit, and the imperial treasury in London stopped paying. Nigeria was not created because its peoples had asked to be joined, nor because administrators had concluded they formed a natural unit. It was created to balance a colonial budget. Lugard governed through what he called indirect rule, and it is the other decision whose consequences run right through the following century. In the north, indirect rule worked as designed because the Sokoto Emirates already had precisely what the system required: a hierarchy of rulers, a tax apparatus, a judiciary, and an administrative tradition. The British defeated them militarily, then kept them in place, ruling through the emirs. The system also involved restricting Christian missionary activity in the north, which meant that Western-style education spread there far more slowly than in the south. That educational gap became a structural feature of Nigerian politics and remains one. In the Yoruba Southwest, indirect rule was workable, since there were kings and chiefs, though their authority was often constrained in ways the British did not fully grasp. In the Igbo Southeast, it failed, because the premise was wrong. Igbo society was largely decentralized, governed through village assemblies, age grades, title societies, and councils of elders, and it did not have chiefs of the kind the system required. So the British appointed some. These warrant chiefs were given certificates of authority and empowered to collect taxes and adjudicate cases, and many had no traditional legitimacy whatsoever. The results were resentment, corruption, and a system experienced as arbitrary. That produced one of the most striking episodes in colonial African history. In 1929, in response to fears that taxation was about to be extended to women, tens of thousands of Igbo and Ibibio women mobilized across the southeast in what the British called the ABA Women's Riots, and what is now generally known as the Women's War, or Ogu Umanwanyai. They used the traditional method of protest, gathering at the compounds of warrant chiefs to sing, dance, and shame them, and the movement escalated to the destruction of native court buildings. Colonial forces fired on crowds, and dozens of women were killed. It was a mass political mobilization by women, organized through existing women's networks, against colonial taxation and imposed authority, in 1929. It forced the British to restructure the warrant chief system. Nationalist politics developed through the following decades. Herbert Macaulay founded Nigeria's first political party in the 1920s. After the Second World War, in which large numbers of Nigerians served, the movement accelerated under a generation of formidable figures: Nnamdi Azikiwe, whose newspapers carried the nationalist argument across the country; Obafemi Awolowo, whose base was in the West and who built a party around a strongly federalist program; and Ahmadu Bello, the Sardauna of Sokoto, who spoke for the northern establishment. The constitutional arrangements of the 50s moved Nigeria toward a federal structure with 3 large regions, and on the 1st of October 1960, Nigeria became independent. The years that followed were difficult, and I am going to describe them carefully, because much of this remains politically contested in Nigeria today, and it is not this channel's place to adjudicate. The federal structure of 3 regions meant that each was dominated by one of the 3 largest ethnic groups, and that regional politics and ethnic politics were effectively the same thing. Disputed elections and a contested census intensified the strain. In January 1966, a group of young army officers staged a coup in which the federal prime minister, the premiers of the North and West, and senior officers were killed. The plotters were predominantly, though not exclusively, Igbo, and the pattern of who died was widely read in the North as an ethnic attack, a reading that the coup's defenders have always disputed. General Aguiyi-Ironsi took power. In July, a counter-coup by northern officers killed him and installed Yakubu Gowon. Through 1966, large-scale violence against Igbo people living in the north killed many thousands and drove a mass flight of survivors back to the southeast. Negotiations to hold the federation together failed. In May 1967, the military governor of the eastern region, Odumegwu Ojukwu, declared the independence of the Republic of Biafra. The federal government declared it a rebellion. The war lasted from July 1967 to January 1970. Federal forces progressively encircled the secessionist territory, and a blockade cut off supply. Mass starvation followed, particularly among children, and images of it reached the world and became some of the defining photographs of the decade. Total deaths are estimated in the range of 1 to 3 million, with the great majority from starvation and disease rather than combat, and those figures remain disputed. The blockade and the question of responsibility for the famine are argued to this day. Biafra surrendered in January 1970. Gowon's government adopted a policy summed up in the phrase "no victor, no vanquished," and pursued a program of reconstruction and reintegration. Assessments of how fully that promise was kept differ sharply, and they differ along lines that are still visible in Nigerian politics. One consequence of the war reached far beyond Nigeria. The international relief operation was enormous, and some of the doctors who worked in Biafra came away convinced that neutrality and silence in the face of mass death were untenable. Out of that conviction came the founding of Médecins Sans Frontières in 1971, and with it a shift in humanitarian practice toward the principle of speaking publicly about what aid workers witness. The modern humanitarian movement carries Biafra in its origins. Now oil. Commercial quantities of petroleum were found at Oloibiri in the Niger Delta in 1956. Production expanded through the 60s, and then the price shocks of the 1970s transformed the country's finances almost overnight. The consequences follow a pattern economists have documented in many petroleum states. Oil revenue flows to the government rather than through a broad tax base, which weakens the link between citizens and the state. The currency strengthens, making other exports uncompetitive, and agriculture, which had been the backbone of the economy and a major export earner in groundnuts, cocoa, and palm produce, declined sharply. A country that had fed itself and exported food became a large importer of it. And control of a single, concentrated revenue stream became the central prize of politics, with the corruption that follows from that. In the Niger Delta itself, where the oil is, the costs were borne locally: spills, gas flaring, damaged fisheries and farmland, and communities that saw little of the revenue generated beneath their feet. The environmental damage in parts of the Delta has been documented by United Nations assessments as severe and long-term. Protest movements grew from this. The most internationally prominent was led by the writer Ken Saro-Wiwa, who organized the Ogoni people around demands for environmental remediation and a share of resources. He and 8 others were tried by a military tribunal and executed in 1995, an act that drew worldwide condemnation and led to Nigeria's suspension from the Commonwealth. Politically, the period from 1966 to 1999 was dominated by military rule, punctuated by a short-lived Second Republic. The most consequential moment came in 1993, when a presidential election widely regarded as the freest the country had held was annulled by the military government, and the presumed winner, Mashood Abiola, was later detained. The crisis that followed brought General Sani Abacha to power, and his years in office were marked by severe repression and by the diversion of very large sums from the state, some of which has since been recovered from foreign accounts. Abacha died in office in 1998. His successor oversaw a transition, and in 1999 Nigeria returned to civilian rule under the Fourth Republic, which has now held continuously for over 2 decades. In 2015, an incumbent president lost an election and handed power to the opposition, the first time that had happened in Nigeria, and a significant moment for the region. The country's contemporary difficulties are real, and I will not skate over them. Insecurity in the northeast arising from the insurgency that began around 2009, banditry and kidnapping in the northwest, farmer-herder conflict across the Middle Belt, separatist agitation in the southeast, corruption, unemployment, and the pressure of an economy still tied to the oil price. These are serious, and Nigerians discuss them more frankly than any outsider does. But it would be a poor account of this country that stopped there, because over the same decades Nigeria has become one of the most powerful exporters of culture on earth. Nollywood began with a practical accident. In 1992, a trader in Lagos with a stock of unsold blank videocassettes financed a film to shift them. Living in Bondage was shot on video, sold direct to consumers and markets, and was an enormous hit. What followed was an entire film industry built outside the cinema system: low budgets, fast shooting schedules, direct distribution, and stories aimed squarely at African audiences rather than at export. By output, Nollywood became one of the largest film industries in the world, and it now reaches audiences across Africa and the diaspora, with production values rising steeply. In music, the influence runs deeper still. Fela Kuti forged Afrobeat in the 70s out of Yoruba rhythm, highlife, jazz, and funk, in long, politically confrontational compositions that made him a target of successive governments. The related but distinct contemporary genre of Afrobeats, with the S, emerged from Lagos in the 2000s and has become a global commercial force, with Nigerian artists filling stadiums on several continents and shaping the sound of mainstream pop. In literature, Chinua Achebe published Things Fall Apart in 1958, a novel that told the story of colonial encounter from inside an Igbo community, and it has since sold in the tens of millions of copies and been translated into dozens of languages. It is probably the most widely read African novel ever written. Wole Soyinka became the first African writer to receive the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1986. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, Ben Okri, Buchi Emekita, and many others have followed. And demographically, Nigeria is one of the most consequential countries on the planet. Its population is somewhere in the region of 230 million, the largest in Africa and the largest of any majority black nation on Earth. United Nations projections have consistently placed it among the top few most populous countries in the world by the middle of this century. Its median age is around 18. Lagos is one of the fastest growing megacities anywhere, and it has become a genuine technology hub, producing companies that have reached valuations in the billions and drawn substantial international investment. Before we come to the modern picture, something should be said about language, because it is where the whole history of this country is most visible in daily life. Nigeria is one of the most linguistically diverse countries on Earth. The commonly cited figure is over 500 living languages, and they belong to several distinct language families, which is to say they are not variants of one another but genuinely separate tongues with separate histories. 3 have very large numbers of speakers: Hausa, Yoruba, and Igbo, each with tens of millions, and Hausa in particular functions as a trade language across a broad swathe of West Africa well beyond Nigeria's borders. English is the official language, inherited from the colonial administration, and it remains the language of government, higher education, and formal business. But the language that has actually done the work of holding a diverse country together in ordinary conversation is Nigerian Pidgin. It grew out of the contact between English and West African languages along the coast during the era of Atlantic trade, drawing vocabulary largely from English and grammatical structure substantially from local languages. It began as a trade jargon, and it did not stay one. It became a fully developed language with its own consistent grammar, spoken across ethnic and regional lines by an enormous number of people, with estimates commonly running well over 100 million speakers including second-language users. Pidgin is now the language of a great deal of Nigerian popular music, comedy, advertising, and broadcasting, and it has a formal presence in international news services. It carries no ethnic ownership, which is exactly why it works. It belongs to nobody in particular, and therefore to everybody. In sport, the national football team reached the World Cup for the first time in 1994 and became one of the most watched African sides in the world, and the Olympic football gold at Atlanta in 1996, won against strong South American opposition, remains one of the landmark results in African sporting history. And there is the diaspora, which has become a significant part of the story. Nigerians abroad send home remittances measured in the tens of billions of dollars annually, a flow of money considerably larger than foreign aid to the country and comparable in scale to some of its export earnings. Nigerian-descended communities in Britain, the United States, and Canada have become notable for educational attainment, and Nigerian names appear across medicine, engineering, finance, literature, academia, and sport in those countries. That outflow is genuinely double-edged, and Nigerians debate it constantly. The departure of doctors, nurses, engineers, and academics represents a real loss of trained capacity to a country that trained them, a pattern often summarized in the phrase brain drain and, more recently and more wryly, in the Nigerian coinage japa. At the same time, the remittances sustain households, and returning members of the diaspora have brought back capital, skills, and networks. Both effects are real and neither cancels the other. Which brings us back to where we started. In 1910, a European scholar looked at the sculpted heads of Ife, saw work of a quality he associated with classical antiquity, and concluded that they must have come from Atlantis, because the alternative, that West Africans had made them, did not present itself to him as possible. Those heads had been cast in Ife, by Ife artists, centuries before he was born, in a city that was old when Europe was building its first cathedrals. And a few hundred kilometers away, bronzes had been cast at Iboakwa 600 years before any European reached that coast, using a technique executed with a precision that specialists still find remarkable. The bronzes of Benin sat in the palace as the written record of a kingdom until a British expedition removed them in 1897 and scattered them through the museums of the world. And in the last few years, some of them have begun to travel back. Nigeria was assembled by strangers to balance a ledger. What it was assembled from was not empty. It was Nak and Ife and Iboakwa and Benin, Oyo with its constitutional check on the power of kings, Kanem-Bornu trading with the Ottomans, Kano's dye pits still running after 500 years, and Sokoto with a woman organizing the education of an empire's daughters in verse. The country is 110 years old. The civilizations inside it are considerably older, and the work of putting the two together is still going on. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more stories of the great cities, empires, and institutions that built the world we live in. Leave a comment below telling us which city, kingdom, or institution you would like us to explore next.